You get a lot of central nervous system dysfunction and impairment, and plumbum metallicum, the homeopathic remedy from lead, has a lot of those same kinds of symptoms, like fuzzy brain, cloud, stupor, central nervous system dysfunction, kidney and liver problems. So it's consistent with what happens in lead poisoning. It's what a patient needing plumbum metallicum might look like. And then lastly, we get information about what these substances can do and what they can, what kinds of patients they will get a result in by looking at clinical data and cured cases. So you have someone who has itchy, red, watery, teary eyes, and you give them the homeopathic remedy Allium cepa, red onion, because you know that if you expose someone to red onion, they're going to have all those eye symptoms, either an improving or a toxicology report. And then you give them that homeopathic remedy, and they become cured of their allergies. Well, that then gets entered into the database that we have for these remedies, and so that's clinical data. It's a cured case. If it's a cured case, then that confirms that indeed what we found from the provings, what we found from the toxicology reports, actually works on a real patient under real homeopathic treatment. So that's how we get the information. It's a long, drawn-out process. But it's been done with thousands of remedies, and it's been done for a long time. So, like I said, most of the remedies we have an incredible amount of information about because they've been in use for over 200 years. There are new remedies coming up all the time. They're used far less often because we just don't know as much about them, which is in stark contrast to the conventional medical model where whatever is newest is best. And any drug coming out, they study it, for a few months, test it on a few people or a few thousand people and say it's safe. How can you can't do that. You can't know that it's safe for 20 years unless you use it for 20 years. So you don't know what the long-term effects of the substance are going to be unless you actually use it for a long period of time. Any questions on provings or how we get information how we assemble the information from the Terra Medica? Okay. So then the next topic under J in the outline is dilution and succussion. It's how homeopathic remedies are prepared. So I'm not going to go into the details about how to make your own homeopathic remedy. You can actually Google that, and there are a lot of different websites that will give you slightly different versions of how to actually make your own homeopathic remedies. And there's more similarities than there are differences. But basically, you start with a remedy, with a substance, and you dilute it, you grind it up into alcohol, and then you start adding water to it. You take a drop of, let's say you take whatever substance, let's say it's sulfur. So you take the mineral sulfur, you add some alcohol, you chop it up, and then you get this tincture of it, and then you take a drop or a small amount of that and add it to like 1 part of the, let's say in this case, 1 part of the sulfur tincture to 10 parts water, and then you shake that up. It's called succussion. So it's actually, if it were in a bottle, it's being like pounded like this, either by hand or by machine, a certain number of times, and then you take a small amount, like 1 part of that substance, put it into 10 parts of water, and then do that. And if you do that 10 times, you now have a 10x potency of that remedy. If you put it in 1 part per 100 and do it 6 times, you've got a 6C potency. So the X, when you see the X's on the remedies, it means it's been prepared however many times. If it's 10x, it's been diluted 10 different times in 1 part per 10. If it's a C, it's been 1 part per 100. So if it's a 6C, it's 1 part per 100, 6 different times. If it's a 30C, it's 1 part per 100, 30 different times. If it's an M, it's 1,000 times. So a 1M potency is 1 part per thousand is 1 part per thousand. If it's like a 200C, which is probably the highest potency you guys would use, it's where I tend to start. It depends on the patients, but there will be 1 part per 100, 200 times. So they're highly diluted, but the theory is that by succussing, by shaking the remedy, that friction of the molecules rubbing back and forth on each other and the particle collision or the molecular collision is imparting an energy, a physical energy, a property, a vibration from that original substance, enhancing it and making it more potent. So the more a remedy is succussed, the more molecular force is applied, molecular particle collision is taking place, the more friction that's happening, it energizes the remedy, it gives it a higher potency. So our higher potencies in homeopathy have in a sense been diluted more. The weaker potencies have been diluted less. But it's not just that they've been diluted more or less, they've been succussed or subject to friction and physical energy more or less. Does that make sense? I mean, not that it makes sense, but you understand what I'm saying. Because it's hard to get, I understand it's hard to get your head around the first time you find out that the higher potency remedies are actually have less original substance than the weaker ones. But what's amazing is when you use these in practice, if you give someone a high potency who's sensitive, they could have a terrible, very severe, intense aggravation. And you give them a lower potency and they do just fine. So it really works. It works through experience. If you have an open enough mind just to try it and just to see what happens, you'll see that it actually does work. I mean, it's reality because it's what happens. It's the experience of homeopath after homeopath after homeopath for the last 200 years. This is how it works.
So you would actually start someone higher and work them down?
No. We typically start lower and work up most of the time. There are times when you go back in the other direction. There's all kinds of little tricks and things to do, but typically you want to start with the potency that you're comfortable is not going to over-aggravate the patient, especially if you're a less experienced prescriber. And over time, that patient will become accustomed to that potency and their body will stop responding, and then you need to go to a higher potency. And you need to go to progressively higher potencies if that person still needs that same remedy, but the healing response kind of slows down after a few months, then you need to go to a higher potency eventually.
Just to clarify, a higher potency has less of the original substance in it.
Yes, just to clarify, a higher potency, a remedy that a patient will react more strongly to, has less of the original substance in it than a lower potency. It's highly counterintuitive to a mind that's not been trained homeopathically. Just a little interesting factoid on the concept of dilution. The concentration of a free thyroid hormone, this is a typo in the outline under J. The concentration of free thyroid hormone in blood is 1 part per 10 million parts of blood plasma. And we all know that thyroid hormone is a really important hormone, and if your levels are low, you could suffer from pretty serious health consequences. And if they're too high, you could suffer from pretty severe health consequences. But the amount of thyroid hormone in the blood is 1 part per 10 million parts of blood plasma. So the body does operate on sometimes minute little scales here. Another thing to think about is if you walk into a house where someone's been baking, like a cookie, if they're cookies, if you start out in the kitchen and you're in there and you're just making the cookie, you don't realize the smell, but if you just walk into the house, it hits you really strong. Or if you're upstairs, it'll take a certain amount of time before you start to smell that. How many molecules of cookies are in the air before they hit your nose and you could perceive a very intense smell of chocolate chip cookies being baked from hundreds of feet away? I mean, there's not even a cookie anywhere near you or in front of you, but you know exactly what it is. It triggers a reaction, you may start to salivate and your mouth water, and it's a really pleasing, maybe a very pleasing aroma and everything. How many molecules of that cookie are now in your nose? A very small amount, you know, very tiny amount, but those particles are traveling there and affect us.
So back to the thing about the higher potency will have less of the original substance. And then you were saying if it's been succussed more, that will even intensify it.
Yes.
So maybe, you know, the same dilution of the same substance in two forms. If one is, you know, agitated.
Yes. So the same. If you take two substances, one that's they've both been diluted the same amount, but one that's been succussed or subject to the forces of friction and particle collision more is going to be more potent, and that is true. Yes. So that's some of you are familiar with taking remedy in water, where you take one little pellet of the remedy and put it in a whole glass of water, and then I tell you to take that as a dose, and you say, really? Because just one little sip? Because you're starting with this tiny little pellet which has nothing in it, then you're putting it in water, now there's really nothing, and you're just taking a little sip of that. How is that the same? And the reason is, if you think about how far that pellet came in terms of dilution, dropping it in one glass of water is not really that much more diluted than what it already is to begin with, right? But then I tell you to stir or shake the water. So every time you do that, you do that every time before you take a dose. So every time you take a dose, you're getting a slightly increased potency than the time you took it before. So that's why it continues to work, even though it seems like it's so diluted.
So if I'm having a bad day with side pain, I take the pill is more potent if I put it in water than under my tongue?
Not necessarily. Some people do respond better to water doses, and some people respond better to dry doses, and some people respond the same, and some people will notice a difference if they shake the container 3 times and then take a sip of water, or they shake it 100 times and take a sip. So depending on how sensitive you are and just how you're made up, you may notice more or less of a difference. But generally speaking, whether you take the remedy in water or a dry dose, it's essentially considered the same potency, it's considered the same, it's still a 200C, let's say. If you take a 200C under your tongue or a 200C in water, it's still a 200C. The difference is in water, it tends to minimize the aggravations, and the more water you use, the less chance of aggravation you tend to have. And how effective it will be compared to a dry dose, compared to a wet dose, is really patient specific. So it's one more factor you have to watch for in terms of, you know, what's working here. It's part of the trial and error part of homeopathy that you just have to kind of see. Okay. Okay, so I want to talk about the placebo response, and that's K in your outline. So the difference between a placebo response and an actual response. The placebo response is this placebo effect is a known, very well studied, very well documented effect. It's not, you know, to say, oh, that's all in your head is kind of an oversimplification. It's a very real thing. So we have to acknowledge that it exists and understand it so it doesn't mess us up when we're treating people. So a typical placebo response is usually very rapid. In fact, it's sometimes too rapid, or it's more rapid than it should be compared to a real response. So if I give someone a remedy and who's had chronic pain their entire life, and they call and I talk to them 10 days later after taking one dose of the remedy, and they tell me that within minutes or hours they were 90 to 100% better, I'm a little skeptical, and I'm thinking it's a red flag for a placebo response. It's too rapid, it's too dramatic, and it's not likely to be a real response. It could be, but it's not typical. So typically the placebo response, like I said, is usually rapid, often unexpectedly so. And then what will happen is there'll be a gradual relapse after that. They'll be better for a little bit, it'll be very short-lived, and then they'll start to, so they'll get, if this is their level of symptom, the symptoms will go way down really quickly, and then it'll kind of gradually start to relapse, come right back to where it was. And each time they take another dose of the remedy, their improvement will be a little less, it'll be less dramatic, and it'll last less time, and they'll be right back where they started from more quickly. The other thing about in homeopathy with the placebo response, lower potencies will tend to trigger a greater reaction than higher potencies. This is not. Okay, I should re-clarify. If a remedy prescribed is not the simillimum or not the most similar, it's only a little bit similar, because similar is a matter of degree, right? So you could have the best remedy is going to be the most similar, and a really poorly chosen remedy is not going to be similar at all. But there's a whole bunch of remedies in the middle that are maybe close but no cigar. So if it's close in similarity but not very similar, then what will happen is a lower potency of a dissimilar remedy will have a better effect than a higher potency. So I'm going to
This does relate
illustrate
to
this here. Placebo response, I promise. So let's think of prescribing as trying to hit a target on a bullseye, okay? So this is, if we get it right in the target, that is the simillimum, which is the most similar remedy. It's kind of an ideal. We always hope we get it. That's going to be the remedy that's going to cure someone over time. If we only get it, then there's all these remedies that will affect the patient, but not as much. And you know, if you prescribe something out here, it's probably not going to affect the patient at all. There'll be no aggravation, there'll be no improvement, nothing. But if we're in this realm, like out here, it's a little similar, but not very. What will happen is a lower potency will tend to trigger a better reaction than a high potency here. In order to get a high potency to work well, it's got to be really similar. And this is just through experience. You could try to reason why, but it's just how it works. Okay? So we can tell if this was placebo. One of the ways we can tell if this was placebo or not is that if we can adjust the potency. So if someone had a huge response and we start going up in potency and it's actually a good remedy for them, it's similar, they should get better and better and better response. But if the higher in potency we go, the lower their response is, we know that we're going in the wrong direction, it's the wrong remedy. And if we go lower and lower and they get a better and better response, we also know it's not a good sign. So Debbie, that was your answer to your question about would you ever go, would you start higher and go lower? Sometimes we might start high and start to go lower just to see what happens. And if the response is a little better, then we know it's probably not a good sign, it's not the right remedy, but at least we can keep using that remedy because it's helping somewhat until we can find a better one. So it'll be helpful, it'll be palliative, but it's not going to be curative.
So in that example, how do you switch? Do you do one at a time, or would you do both?
That's a little more of an advanced question, so we'll talk about that as we go. So eventually with a placebo response then, the patient returns to their original state. They're not, and you don't get any kind of cure. Okay? So now I'm going to talk about the true response to a homeopathic remedy. A true healing response to a well-chosen, similar remedy. If this is let's say this is the baseline level of symptoms that a person has, you give a good remedy, and what's going to happen is immediately their symptoms are going to go up. They're going to have an initial aggravation. Typically, most often, not always, but it's a good sign that the remedy was well chosen, that they have an initial aggravation. Okay? Then, after that aggravation, they'll start to improve, and hopefully they'll even improve below this. So now they're doing better than they were before. Their level of symptoms are lower than they were before, and then eventually they'll start to plateau. And then if nothing happens at all, they'll start to gradually worsen, and eventually they'll either be as bad as they were, or maybe they'll be slightly better for a long time. And if nothing's done, and the patient never follows up, they'll say, oh yeah, the homeopathy worked for a while, I was getting better, but then I kind of was just like the same, so I stopped taking it. And then, yeah, I guess I'm a little better now, but you know, I quit my job and that was stressful, so it was probably just that. And then that's it. But if you continue to treat, then what you want to do, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. All right. So, well, yeah, if you repeat the dose somewhere in here, which is where you want to repeat it, this is where you'd want to repeat the dose if you're taking the remedy as needed. Because at this point, the improvement, most of the improvement is kind of stopped. They're in a pretty plateaued state. They're not really